I'm Rowland from the University of Kansas. What a great place to reassess Ronald Reagan's rhetorical legacy. And we've got such great reasons to do that. I think Reagan is routinely recognized as in the same class for eloquence as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and only slightly behind Abraham Lincoln. And that's not such a bad thing, to only be slightly behind Abraham Lincoln. He used his words to win 2 overwhelming presidential victories, and his words helped shape what has been called by many authors the age of Reagan. We have 4 panelists today, and I'm going to introduce them now, and then we're simply going to go in the order that's listed. And we have agreed that we're going to take no more than 15 to 16 minutes each, leaving some time for discussion at the end. I know there are very distinguished scholars in the room, and we will all look forward to that. The first presenter is Allison Prasch from the University of Wisconsin. The world has this stage, Reagan's foreign policy, rhetoric, and invocation of peace, and she's talking about research done as part of her outstanding new book. Randall Fowler of Abilene Christian University is going to talk about the great communicator and the great Satan, revisiting Reagan's approach to Iran. Elizabeth Spalding from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and Pepperdine is going to talk about the evil empire and SDI and the moral rhetoric of peace through strength. And with some trepidation, I'm going to bat cleanup and talk about the arc of Reagan's Soviet rhetoric, a grand strategy for the Cold War. Allison.
All right, thank you all very much. I had a brief title change at the last minute, so apologies that I did not let you know that. But The World is His Stage, Scenes from Reagan's Rhetorical Legacy. If the Cold War was a drama enacted in various places and moments on the world stage, Ronald Reagan played a starring role. His was the marquee name, the actor who appeared on set at pivotal junctures in this geopolitical contest. And in fact, for many U.S. Americans, the 40th President of the United States spoke as the ultimate Cold Warrior, a persona that Reagan cultivated, embodied, and embraced. A hallmark of Reagan's rhetorical skill lay in his ability to make complex policies, proposals, and ideas come quite literally to life by using images, bodies, and places to bolster his argument. Aristotle once defined rhetoric as the ability to see, in each particular case, all the available means of persuasion. This description positions rhetoric as a radically contingent exercise, one that requires the orator to first identify and then to address the complexities of the political and the historical moment, while also attending to the overlapping and often conflicting expectations of multiple audiences. No small task. But as I detail in my recent book and other published work, some of the most important means of persuasion Reagan deployed came not just through his words, but through the images, the stories, and the people and the places he gestured to rhetorically. In so doing, he invited his audience to see themselves as participants in the narrative that he recounted. And in fact, I would go so far as to argue that this invocation of images, bodies, and places is what made him the great communicator. To be sure, his language was eloquent, moving, and able to help members of the U.S. public see themselves as part of the national narrative he described. But it was also physical, tangible, and material, laid in with elements, the vivid pictures he displayed, the ordinary civic actors he featured, and the symbolic places from which he chose to speak. This is what made his image of the nation come to life. And so in today's talk, I revisit 3 specific scenes in which Reagan used his rhetoric to bring people and places before the eyes of his audience. And although these specific episodes are, I would imagine, well known to many in this room, I draw on these examples not just to demonstrate how the centrality of images, bodies, and places in Reagan's rhetorical practice created a lasting template for all future presidents to use, but also to demonstrate how future presidents after Reagan utilized these strategies and they've come to shape how we think about and how we talk about our expectations for presidential rhetoric. Scene 1, visualizing the landscape of U.S. history. When Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election by more than 8 million votes, many saw Reagan's victory as a direct rejection of Carter's policies at home and abroad. Paul Fessler notes that when Ronald Reagan took office in early 1981, the United States appeared weak and faltering. In foreign affairs, the United States, still reeling from defeat in Vietnam, faced not only a Soviet Union expanding into Afghanistan, but also a major hostage crisis in Iran. It seemed as if America's self-image as a strong, confident international superpower was fading into a distant memory. Reagan addressed this perception of a weakened America in his inaugural address, pledging that as the nation took the steps to, quote, renew ourselves here in our own land, we will be seen as having greater strength throughout the world and be the exemplar of freedom and a beacon of hope for those who do not now have freedom. As John Jones and Robert Rowland have argued, Reagan's first inaugural address offered a foundational statement of his governing philosophy and of contemporary conservatism by offering we the people as the antidote to big government. The heroes of this moment were, Reagan argued, ordinary Americans who went about their lives and their livelihoods with quiet determination, a form of patriotism. But Reagan also used the place or location of his address to remind his audience of a shared historical narrative, one he believed would inspire a renewed sense of national identity. In so doing, he also established a new norm for presidential inaugural addresses. For the first time, the ceremonies were held on the west front of the U.S. Capitol building, allowing the assembled audience to look out over the National Mall as the new president spoke. Photographers and news organizations also captured and circulated images of the scene, and those watching television coverage at home were transported to the site through vivid imagery and depiction. And so you're now going to see in this clip, which was broadcast on C-SPAN, what viewers at home may have seen. You're not missing sound. I'm just showing you the images as I talk about it. Toward the end of his speech, Reagan emphasized the significance of this view. And he said, standing here, one faces a magnificent vista opening up on this city's special beauty and history. The president went on to reference sites such as the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, and the Lincoln Memorial, and then, across the Potomac, Arlington National Cemetery. Reagan said that inspired by those giants on whose shoulders we stand, he asked his audience to see themselves as a living, breathing link between past, present, and future, a nation of individual actors who could, with their best effort and their willingness to believe in themselves and to believe in their capacity to perform great deeds, that they could confront the problems facing the nation. Reagan's depiction of these people, places, and moments that comprise the nation's history was made possible by his direct references to the markers on the symbolic landscape before him. Later, U.S. presidents followed suit, with the exception of Reagan's second inaugural, which was held indoors due to bitterly cold temperatures. All successive inaugurations have been held on the west front of the U.S. Capitol building. Several presidents, including Barack Obama and Joseph R. Biden, have also rhetorically gestured to the scene set before them to evoke a shared historical narrative. Most recently, in January 2021, and just 2 weeks after the attack on the U.S. Capitol building, Biden repeatedly pointed his audience to various places on the National Mall to remind his audience of the sacred nature of the space. And in so doing, he also noted the resiliency of the American project. Like Reagan, Biden reminded his audience of other moments in which U.S. democracy had been tested and yet endured. This was a history that was not certain, not guaranteed. The democratic experiment was one that required collective commitment, a respect for and a conservation of the nation's most foundational ideals and principles. The challenge now, Biden said, was whether the nation could meet this moment and write the next great chapter in the history of the United States. And it is a challenge that remains. Scene 2, elevating ordinary American heroes. 1 year and 6 days after his first inaugural address on January 26, 1982, Ronald Reagan delivered his first State of the Union address. In his speech, he cast a hopeful vision for American renewal, even as he addressed the weak economy and proposed deep cuts to the federal budget. But what made Reagan's 1982 State of the Union address notable transformative even, was his salute to Lenny Skutnik during the final moments of his speech. Just 2 weeks earlier, Skutnik dived into the frigid waters of the Potomac River to rescue a passenger of an Air Florida plane that crashed into the 14th Street Bridge during takeoff from what was then known as Washington National Airport. We now know it, of course, as the Ronald Reagan Airport. Skutnik became an overnight celebrity, and the media replayed his heroic jump for millions of Americans on the evening news. The White House invited Skutnik and his wife, Linda, to sit next to First Lady Nancy Reagan in the House gallery during Reagan's address. And the president concluded his speech by identifying Skutnik as an example of the spirit of American heroism at its finest. Even as he honored Skutnik publicly, Reagan also used the young government employee to represent what he called the, quote, countless quiet everyday heroes, unquote, who sacrificed their time and their energy to revitalize the American spirit. By literally pointing out Skutnik to those assembled in the House gallery and to millions of Americans watching at home, Reagan helped his audience visualize what he was describing. The ideals of a modern American hero were now reflected in the person of Lenny Skutnik. This salute to Skutnik inaugurated a new generic norm for the State of the Union address. Prior to 1982, presidents relied on strategies of language to deliver their report to Congress. But Reagan's featuring of one ordinary civic hero introduced a new rhetorical strategy by which presidents now display individuals as evidence for their argument. Beginning with Reagan, this now expected invocation of a Skutnik offers presidents the opportunity to display, both rhetorically and physically, the civic ideals they wish to laud, the national issues they deem important, and the policy proposals they wish to advance. These Skutniks then provide a physical representation of the overall body politic, a living, breathing metaphor testifying that the State of the Union is, in fact, strong. The presidential deployment of Skutniks can also provide a cautionary tale, one that can be used to galvanize members of Congress and, by extension, the U.S. public. Such was the case in 2018 when Donald Trump warned of the threat North Korea's nuclear arsenal posed to the United States and its allies. To underscore the point, the president featured several individuals who had direct experience with the depraved character of the North Korean regime. And one of them included Ji Sung-hoo, a North Korean defector who escaped to South Korea in 2006. And so you can see in this image, the crowd is applauding, and Mr. Sung-ho is holding up his crutches because he had lost 2 limbs as part of his escape and prior to his life in North Korea. President Trump heralded Mr. Sung-ho's bravery and sacrifice as, quote, a testament to the yearning of every human soul to live in freedom, unquote. This was, Trump argued, the same desire that had inspired early Americans to declare independence from Great Britain and to form the United States. And like Reagan had first done in 1982, Trump called the U.S. public to recognize, quote, the heroes who lived not only in the past but all around us, defending hope, pride, and the American way. The task now, he said to his audience, was, quote, to respect them, to listen to them, to serve them, to protect them, and to always be worthy of them, unquote. And this is a task that remains. Scene 3, commemorating D-Day. Reagan's deployment of bodies in place continued 2 years later when he commemorated the 40th anniversary of D-Day. In his speech at Pointe du Hoc, Reagan told the story of the daring mission that 225 U.S. Army Rangers undertook on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944. Their mission, he said, was one of the most difficult and daring of the entire invasion. For these U.S. Army Rangers were to climb up the sheer and desolate cliffs behind him, and you can see those in the image on the right, to take out the enemy guns that could have decimated the rest of the Allied warships ferrying troops across the English Channel. Throughout his 13-minute speech, Reagan repeatedly referenced the 62 surviving U.S. Army Rangers who enacted the narrative he had described and who were seated before him. And he reminded his audience that they were here together in the very place where these events unfolded. Now, to be sure, the text of this speech is moving, eloquent, beautiful. It's a rhetorical masterpiece. But what made it stand out as an exemplar of presidential commemoration was how Reagan repeatedly pointed his audience to physical, material evidence, the boys of Pointe du Hoc, and the sheer and desolate cliffs behind him, to encapsulate his argument. The decision to feature these people and places was not some mere rhetorical flourish. Instead, it was a deliberate rhetorical strategy supported by Reagan's White House speech writing team, most specifically Peggy Noonan, Secretary of State George P. Shultz, and a number of White House advance staff. Indeed, as materials from the Reagan Library here make plain, officials saw the president's featuring of the boys of Pointe du Hoc and his rhetoric in place as a central part of his overall commemoration. Numerous U.S. presidents have followed his example. But I think it's important to note how Reagan's commemorative action extended well beyond the 40th anniversary of D-Day and also influenced his re-election campaign. In fact, the retelling of the Normandy invasion became a central part of the 1984 convention film. The producers of the convention documentary that was shown in Dallas that fall explained in one memo to the campaign that their goal was to position Reagan as a narrator of a shared history. They wrote that there would be no interviewer or narrator, only the voice of the president. And I quote from their memo, "He is our guide, in effect, through the film. As the president speaks, we begin to dissolve through and see those actual elements of which he's speaking. The verbal images become visual images. We see and hear those moments the president is talking about, and we begin to relive those events and experiences on film," unquote. On the final evening of the 1984 Republican National Convention in Dallas, the U.S. public encountered these striking images in an 18-minute campaign film. And what is up on the screen is the portion of the film that uses Reagan's speech at Pointe du Hoc. Entitled A New Beginning, the striking video montage featured snippets of Reagan's speeches at Pointe du Hoc, including sweeping panoramic shots of the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc and endless rows of white crosses and stars of David in the Normandy American Cemetery. The most poignant aspect of this section was how the campaign interspersed Reagan's speeches with actual footage of the men storming the beaches on June 6, 1944. The video also featured close shots of the 62 boys of Pointe du Hoc that were present for Reagan's address. And as the audience listened to Reagan's narrative of the Allied landings at Normandy, they watched black and white footage of soldiers swimming to shore. When Reagan recounted the courageous climb of the U.S. Army Rangers 40 years earlier, the camera zoomed in on the faces of the aged veterans. This juxtaposition of text and image provided a striking tribute, not just to the men who fought at Normandy, but it also reinforced Reagan's image as a focused, patriotic head of state dedicated to protecting U.S. democracy at home and around the world. Conclusion, Reagan's rhetorical legacy. As these scenes make plain, Reagan's rhetorical skill was not due to words alone. The president frequently used his spoken oratory to bring people, places, and historical events literally before the eyes of the audience, helping them to see or imagine the policies and events he sought to describe. Throughout his presidency, Reagan relied on such imagery to make complex policy proposals tangible and relatable to the ordinary citizen. His vision for what the nation had been, what it was, and what it could be came to life on the National Mall. His hope for an active, engaged U.S. public was embodied in the person of Lenny Skutnik, an everyday American hero. And his enduring belief in the West's commitment to defending democracy in Europe was encapsulated by the physical presence of 62 U.S. Army Rangers 40 years after they scaled the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. But these examples also demonstrate how the words and actions of U.S. presidents shape the norms of presidential public address, not just what we expect a president to do or say within a particular context, but also how their speech shapes and contributes to the nation's character, its ethos, its overarching narrative and sense of self. When the president speaks, people listen, and they respond in kind. What a president says and how they say it matters. The choices of individual chief executives set a precedent for what the public can and should expect to hear from their leader. Past choices dictate present expectations, and the rhetoric of past presidents shapes the choices current and future chief executives make, for good or for ill. As president, Reagan understood the significance of these rhetorical norms, and even more importantly, his sacred responsibility to protect and defend the institution of the U.S. presidency and the U.S. Constitution. As we reflect on Reagan's legacy, rhetorical and otherwise, we would do well to consider what the 40th president's vision of the nation and his fundamental respect for the presidency as an institution might teach us, and what it might require of us in the present and in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, let me say, slightly taller. It's an honor to have you all here, especially knowing that Taylor Swift is performing down the road this evening. So I'm very glad that you're all here. I learned that this morning at the hotel. Okay, so my talk is over Reagan and Iran. Typically when we think about Reagan in the Middle East, oftentimes we think of Lebanon, perhaps the airstrikes in Libya, or the Iran-Contra scandal. But I want to refocus us on a topic that isn't often discussed, and that is Reagan's relationship with the Islamic Republic. So, to begin, I'll set the scene for you. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. In 1979, much changed in the Middle East. And I'm just going to highlight 3 events that you may or may not be aware of. Number 1, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, beginning their 10-year occupation of the country. Number 2, Juhayman al-Otaibi and several Islamist radicals with him occupied the Grand Mosque in Mecca, and they held it for 2 weeks until French special forces were able to evacuate them from the premises. And third, of course, you have the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis that it resulted in. And so during the 1980 campaign, Reagan didn't necessarily raise the issue, but it was, of course, dominant in media narratives and on the evening news. In December 1977, Jimmy Carter very regrettably said the Shah was an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. As late as August 1978, he received a CIA report that said that Iran is not in a revolutionary or even pre-revolutionary state. November the next year, the U.S. ambassador in Iran cabled back to Washington. The authority of the Shah has been considerably shrunk. His support among the general public has become almost invisible. We need to think the unthinkable at this time. And of course, the unthinkable did occur. And Ronald Reagan, during October 1980, made his one remark where he said, "I just don't understand why these hostages are still there." And of course, this has been described as a germinal media event, right? We have Walter Cronkite, Ted Koppel going on the air every single night saying it's been this many days since the hostages have been taken. It dominates the airwaves. And Carter even says, "I wish if I had sent one more helicopter, I would have won re-election," right? So this was an event that, of course, primed the American public to view the Islamic Republic in a very negative way, that Americans have very hostile attitudes towards Iran as a result of this, but it's not clear what meaning this will take within Reagan's larger foreign policy dramas. So we look at Ronald Reagan. He comes into office, the consummate Cold Warrior, and he casts a vision of a two-sided conflict, both globally and in the Middle East. And the vehicle through which he articulated that was strategic consensus. Strategic consensus was primarily the catchphrase of Alexander Haig, who was Reagan's first Secretary of State. And they said, we're going to go to the region, we're going to unite all of our allies there in recognition of a common threat, the Soviet Union in the region. And so Al Haig departed on a diplomatic trip, and he went to Jordan, he went to Cairo, he went to Riyadh, and he went and spoke with U.S. allies across the region and said, you know, why don't we set our differences aside and all recognize that the Soviet Union is the greater threat? It did not go well. He did not, let's say, find success. In fact, a Kuwaiti newspaper that I had the joy of reading thought that it was all a plot for him to lead Marines in to occupy an oil field. So you have a situation where the Reagan administration retreats from the strategic consensus idea, but I think that there's three elements of this basic premise. Number one, that the Middle East is a battlefield. Number two, that battlefield has two sides that are fighting it out. And number three, that the U.S. will lead this battle in some form or fashion. And so I think these three themes continue on. And so I'm going to pivot to my manuscript here, but I wanted to set the scene for you and discuss the three acts of Reagan and Iran. So you might have noticed I've been talking a lot about the Soviet Union and not as much about Iran in this drama. And the reason for that is because Iran did not fit well within this picture painted by the Reagan administration. It sits awkwardly as a non-communist state but still hostile to the United States. And so my overarching claim is that Reagan's treatment of Iran was a tale of two terms. During the first 4 years of the Reagan presidency, he depicted Iran in criminal language, using metaphors of misconduct to depict the revolutionary regime as a violator of international law. This picture of Iran as a miscreant fit well, one-on-one, not as well within the overall strategic consensus campaign, which viewed the Soviet Union as the source of all regional disorder. By the second term, however, the administration had come to view Iran as a major threat to U.S. Gulf oil access, and it shifted from the rhetoric of criminality to that of enemyship. Drawing overt equivalences between the menace posed by Iran and the Soviet Union in the Persian Gulf, Reagan borrowed from language he had used earlier to describe communists to vilify the regime in Tehran. In the picture painted by Reagan's rhetoric, Iran sought to impose its tyrannical rule as a would-be hegemon, cutting off the needed oil supplies to the United States and its allies. This picture found purchase and press coverage, which maligned the revolutionary Islamic Republic, and in the process, these outlets also circulated this equivalence between Iran and the Soviet Union and Persian Gulf security and U.S. access to the oil in the region. So Act 1. As neither a U.S. ally nor a communist state, Tehran did not feature prominently in the administration's early efforts to rally regional allies against the Soviet Union. Instead, Reagan described the country as a criminal. He said, Iran should have a government, quote, that would abide by international law, end quote, if it wished for better relations with the United States. When asked if he would permit U.S. oil companies to return to operate there eventually, he questioned whether Iran could even enforce its own laws. Reagan highlighted Iran's delinquency again when hostages returned, saying that it should, quote, be aware that when the rules of international behavior are violated, our policy will be one of swift and effective retribution, end quote. In a statement honoring the freed hostages, he contrasted their dignity, determination, and quiet courage with the abuse of their captors, implying that heroism was, quote, something the Iranians did not understand. To reinforce this characterization, Reagan commonly accused Iran of committing acts of terrorism. He did that during the 1980 campaign. Weeks into his presidency, he thanked Margaret Thatcher for British efforts to bring the American prisoners home from Iran, and in the next breath he said, together we will work to continue to confront the scourge of international terrorism. Indeed, Reagan invoked the threat of international terrorism rather often in relation to Iran. In a 1982 address, he called for a political settlement in the Iran-Iraq conflict, and then immediately exhorted hearers to continue the fight against international terrorism. Other times, Reagan referenced the threat which international terrorism presents to the free world and the dire peril that terrorism and intimidation in the Gulf posed. This was why he continually characterized the Persian Gulf as a perilous region. These references work to isolate Tehran, both in terms of coverage and the treatment of the administration, but also on the world stage. Brian McCann writes that criminality is not a static state of meaning, but highly contingent. Rhetorics of law and order inscribe markers of fear. Those markers, in turn, work to justify criminal surveillance and confinement. By invoking fears associated with Khomeini's regime, terrorism, lawlessness, and the hostage crisis, Reagan's utterances rationalized a policy of isolation, portraying it as a rogue, felonious state. Policing, not military confrontation, was the logic of the rhetoric of criminality. And of course, since Khomeini was hardly a communist, this rhetorical formula offered a way out of the strategic consensus framework. Reagan didn't need to say that Iran was on the side of the Soviet Union, merely that it was an outlaw state in an early outworking of the rogue state idea. He said that it was ruled by a fanatical theocracy that was beyond the normal rules of the Cold War. And so, he continually summoned metaphors like being a sheriff or a cop. So the United States should treat Iran like it did all squalid criminals and lawbreakers. He said, we're going to bring the full weight of the law against them. Ultimately, this worked to subordinate Iran to the Soviet Union as the primary threat that Reagan identified in the Persian Gulf. And I'll skip through all the examples I have of U.S. media coverage because we do not have time for that. All right, Act 2, enemyship. This assessment of Iran began to change near the end of Reagan's first term as the administration started to modify its internal evaluation of the Gulf. A May 1984 NSC report reveals this shift in thinking. titled Politically Sensitive Approach to Enhanced Military Cooperation with the Key Gulf Arabs, the paper first reiterated the administration's elusive goal of organizing a truly multilateral effort to defend Western access to the Gulf. It then enumerated the various threats to Western access to the Gulf, and it said, although the continuing Soviet occupation of Afghanistan is a constant reminder of the larger menace, it said, the stalemate in attrition warfare in Afghanistan had made that less immediate and less poignant. Consequently, the paper argued, a new danger had started to be on par with the Soviet Union. Iran, and its particular brand of Islamic fundamentalism, has become the most immediate threat to the moderate Arabs, the NSC report said. By formally arguing that Iran represented a more direct security threat to the American allies in the Gulf than the Soviet Union, this report captured a broader shift away from a strict fixation on Moscow. And Reagan had long, of course, called the revolutionary regime a danger, and he characterized it as this lawless, malevolent actor on the world stage. He had denounced the barbaric persecution of the Baha'i faithful in Iran. He regularly said that Tehran was, quote, a place where international law and common decency were mocked. So while it was common for him to use these invectives in his public utterances, at no time prior to this that I was able to find in the archives did the president or the NSC say that Tehran was as dangerous as Moscow in the Persian Gulf. This change in the administration's thinking shown most clearly in Weinberger's June 1987 report to Congress on Gulf security. The 28-page document was intended to address legislative fears that Reagan had made an open-ended, unilateral American commitment to defend all non-belligerent shipping in the Persian Gulf. This is during the Iran-Iraq War. The U.S. started escorting oil tankers through the Gulf and clearing mines as a way to make sure that oil access continued and was not hampered by the war. Ultimately, what this report said, the free world was heavily dependent on oil, which meant it was our vital national interests are at stake in the Gulf. And this meant that the threat of Iranian hegemony over the Gulf presented an equal hazard to the Soviet Union when it came to the free flow of oil. And so this report marked an evolution. Like Haig, Weinberger distilled an image of the Persian Gulf as under terrific threat from an imperialistic aspirant to regional dominance. Unlike Haig, Weinberger identified Iran, not the Soviet Union, as this dangerous foe. This portrayal of Iran as an equal, if not greater threat than the Soviet Union thus grew out of the original image put forth by the Reagan administration of a two-sided conflict with an imperialistic power seeking to gain advantage over the region. The body of the report went into more detail. It said, since the Gulf is a region of vital economic importance, we have strategic interest in ensuring that it does not come under the dominion or hegemony of a power hostile to the United States. And so this is an echo of the Carter Doctrine, but it takes a step further by identifying Iran, not the Soviet Union, as the country at threat. And so the magnitude of this development can be seen in how the report described Gulf domination by Moscow or Tehran as equally menacing. Either, quote, Soviet or Iranian hegemony in the Gulf, end quote, it stated, would represent a serious strategic setback. And so for the first time since the beginning of the Cold War, since all the way back to Truman, U.S. defense planners talked about a country other than the Soviet Union as a power that might be able to dominate the Gulf and its oil. And so on a rhetorical level, this was marked by a shift to enemyship. Under an enemyship framework, rhetoricians make an active and ongoing construction of an enemy who must be vanquished, as Jeremy Ingalls observes in his book Enemyship. Rulers can bolster their authority and manufacture consent in such a way to provide rhetorical cover for leaders to prosecute aggressive policies against those identified as enemies of the nation. And that was certainly the case in this instance. Once we get to intervention, we have the United States taking active steps to confront Iran militarily and to, as Reagan said, let me find my quote here. Reagan promised to find ways to end this scourge once and for all. So I'll skip through my other quotes that Reagan had, and we'll get to intervention. By a show of hands, has anybody heard of Operation Praying Mantis? Okay, we have a couple hands. All right. This move to describe Iran as an enemy took place in the midst of hostile engagements between the two countries. These clashes built on earlier actions taken by the administration in the Iran-Iraq War. After it had begun to share geospatial intelligence with Iraq in 1982, for example, the administration launched Operation Staunch, which was a global effort to halt conventional weapons sales to Iran. In 1984, U.S. ships started escorting oil tankers through the Gulf. From 84 to 86, Iranian torpedoes and mines damaged 67 oil tankers, which significantly increased global gas prices and maritime insurance rates. And so Reagan reacted by ordering the U.S. Navy to conduct more minesweeping escort missions, reflagging operations and retaliatory strikes, which culminated on April 18th, 1988, when U.S. warships sank over half of Iran's navy in Operation Praying Mantis. Days later, Reagan followed up this action by commanding the Navy to use military force to defend neutral ships from Iran. And then, of course, on July 3rd, the trigger-happy, quote, USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air 655, a civilian plane carrying 300 passengers. Reagan attributed this tragic incident to the ongoing war, which he blamed Iran for continuing. And so, Operation Praying Mantis still ranks as the largest U.S. naval battle since World War II. Reagan's portrayal of Iran as an enemy was therefore not simply a matter of words. His language functioned to legitimate actual military operations against Khomeini's regime. In this regard, Reagan's characterization of Iran as an enemy that demanded active intervention to stop, and as a danger to Gulf security and U.S. allies there, prompted a pivotal step towards the United States not only articulating a responsibility to protect the Gulf, but also asserting a military right of intervention to exercise that duty as it saw fit. Iran-Contra doesn't fit nicely in this story when, of course, the United States was caught selling weapons to Iran. But I would argue, and I'll end with this, that Iran-Contra operates as evidence for the thesis that Iran underwent a transformation under Reagan's presidency. After the '79 revolution, it was unclear what Iran's relationship to the United States would be, especially coming from a president who focused so much on the rhetoric of Cold War and the Soviet Union, the overarching threat. By the end of his presidency, many of these topoi that he had applied to communist countries, that they were aggressive, imperialistic, that they sought to dominate their neighbors, had been transferred to Iran. The fact that the Iran-Contra scandal happened and it generated such outrage is a testimony to how much this vision was accepted by the American people. And so I think, to conclude my talk, I would say that observers who saw Iran-Contra at the time were left with one of two conclusions. Either the Reagan administration had lied about Iran being an enemy, or it had dealt weapons to a nation it described as a threat to the flow of Gulf oil and, by extension, U.S. national security. That Reagan chose to admit a lapse in judgment rather than argue that Iran was not quite so bad is instructive, for it shows how salient the image of Iran as an American enemy was in the eyes of the administration and perhaps the public. By the time the Iran-Iraq War had ended, the U.S. Navy had shot down a civilian airliner, disabled Iranian oil platforms, destroyed the bulk of Iran's navy, and, of course, had cleared thousands and thousands of mines. These actions marked a stark contrast from the administration's early days of proclaiming that the Soviet Union lurked behind all the Middle East's ills. Whereas Reagan had started out arguing that the Persian Gulf was simply part of the wider Cold War, by 1988 his team was effectively making the case that conditions unique to the Gulf, most of all the threat Iran allegedly posed to the free flow of oil, mandated military operations be undertaken for reasons disconnected from the larger Cold War. Ironically, Reagan fulfilled the Carter Doctrine's pledge that the United States would prevent a hostile power from seizing control of the Gulf, not by targeting the Soviet Union, but by authorizing air and naval strikes against the nation's former Gulf ally. Thank you.
Thank you to the Reagan Library and to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute and all the other partners, including one I'm affiliated with, Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. It is fitting we meet to discuss and analyze all things Reagan, especially during the ongoing 40th anniversaries of his presidency. I'm one of the participants here focused on the meaning and significance of President Ronald Reagan's key speeches and how they help us understand his strategic and moral thinking. My questions: how did Reagan get to 1983, especially March 1983? What made Reagan Reagan, and what did he bring to the White House with him? What was the end of his Cold War strategy of peace through strength expressed and pursued as president, especially in two central speeches at a moment Reagan both saw and helped to make? Did he stay the course, so to speak? What, if anything, can we learn from this strategy for today? And some of these questions, obviously, will have to be saved for discussion here and, I hope, throughout the conference. In a year that was, in retrospect, a key inflection point in the Cold War, March 1983 marked a critical month for Reagan. The Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, is often dismissed as technologically unfeasible, or it is presented as either an aspirational idiosyncratic element of Reagan's defense buildup or as a bargaining chip that he stubbornly refused to use in later Cold War symmetry. Such interpretations devalue and ignore Reagan's own thinking that informs his visionary project. This thinking is best understood, especially in the proximate setting, by examining Reagan's announcement of SDI in his March 23rd remarks on defense and national security, in combination with his more famous statement just over 2 weeks earlier. In the profound, long-term context, this thinking is best understood by examining how Reagan got to March 1983. The Evil Empire speech of March 8th distills a lifetime of reflection on human nature, theology, politics, and freedom. SDI should be seen as a practical manifestation of Reagan's political, strategic, moral, and religious understanding of the Cold War, which he describes in the Evil Empire speech as part of the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. And in the time here, I would like to briefly go through these four areas, political, strategic, moral, and religious, to understand how Reagan got to March 1983 and how he understood what he was saying and doing. Political. Reagan placed the Cold War and the necessities, requirements, and contingencies imposed by the central conflict of his time in his framework for politics overall. Justice was central, as was freedom, a good in and of itself and a necessity to the exercise of justice. He wanted to be a man of peace, not war, and said this privately and publicly. And I have seen in my week of research, my days of research here, many examples of this. So it's good to have something confirmed when you come to the archives, right? For Reagan, peace followed from justice and freedom and should be defined by those with a similar outlook. This is a key reason that a recurring Reagan theme concerns the importance of and need for the unity of the West against Soviet totalitarian communism. The principles inspiring a government mattered to him, as did its structuring institutions and attitude toward the individual, family, and community. Reagan viewed ideology, a single fixed worldview that carried within it a revolutionary plan to transform man, state, and society, as a perversion of politics. In the 20th century, ideology brought forth totalitarianism in two species, communism and Nazism. From the 1940s on, Reagan spoke against totalitarianism and often interchanged use of totalitarian and communist when referring to the Soviet Union. In general, Reagan viewed totalitarianism as a vehicle with its rotten core made up of radical ideology and an illegitimate regime. For Reagan, as for other students of totalitarianism, from Anna Arendt to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the ideology and the lies upon which it is based informs the ism. Strategic. Reagan typically operated at the level of principle, looking at the Cold War at its highest level. It was not his goal to go to war, but there was always the risk of hot war. Reagan saw the Cold War as a real conflict. He did not believe in mere stability or a long peace between what he viewed as two worlds at complete odds. He thought détente was not only politically and morally mistaken, but also strategically incorrect because it enabled Soviet repression and aggression and extended the Cold War. In this sense, the U.S. defense buildup and the economic and technological strangulation of the USSR were tools, not ends. So were diplomacy and dialogue. In the correct circumstances, Reagan could and would use various tools. At the level of strategy, he spoke of a forward strategy for freedom to achieve peace through strength. To help illuminate the stakes of the Cold War, Reagan quoted Lenin. Example, "It is inconceivable that the Soviet Republic should continue to exist for a long period side by side with imperialistic states. Ultimately, one or the other must conquer." And I found yesterday in files here at the library that Reagan knew a variation on this phrasing from Lenin at least as early as 1962. Reagan cited Brezhnev about the correlation of forces being on communism's side, and he understood that Lenin said the same and that communists did not define coexistence as détente did. For Reagan, at the level of grand strategy, the Cold War could not be wished away, idealism, or made into routine balance of power politics, realism. As early as 1961, Reagan stated, "There can only be one end to the war we are in. It won't go away if we simply try to outweight it. Wars end in victory or defeat." And this is the strategic context in which to place Reagan's famous "we win, they lose" through peace through strength. Moral. As he had taken Lenin seriously as a strategic thinker, Reagan took the American and Soviet regime seriously. The United States form of government was built on natural and God-given rights, the consent of the governed, the rule of law, and limited government. Rights were secured, not created, by this Republican form of government. Reagan said all this for decades. In opposition, the Soviet Union's system required the abolition of individual rights, the false promise and subsequent negation of collective rights, lack of consent and the repression of dissent, tyranny and the unlimited state and party. When Reagan referred in a 1975 radio commentary to a disease-like communism, he offered a regime judgment. And due to this understanding of the regime, Reagan distinguished between legitimate and illegitimate governments. The Soviet Union, although a superpower in world affairs by dint of its military and natural resources, was, in Reagan's view, an illegitimate regime. If it could go, it should go. This is the moral context in which to put Reagan's "we win, they lose" through peace through strength. For Reagan, the USSR was not only illegitimate with respect to its government and its treatment of the peoples within its legally recognized borders, but it was also an illegitimate empire with respect to the peoples and nations it enslaved and threatened outside its legally recognized borders. For him, no moral equivalence could or should be made between the opposing regimes in the Cold War. Religious. Reagan's deepest well of inspiration, his religious faith, is intertwined with the political, strategic, and moral. How did he look at God and the human condition, at grace and flaws, at problems ultimately conquered by faith, hope, and love? And researching here this week, I have asked archivists if there are more letters to be found like the one Karen Tumulty discovered 5 or so years ago from Reagan to his dying father-in-law. Of the theological virtues, Reagan was a man of hope with faith and love. He believed in the triumph of good, not passively, not fatalistically, with man and in practice, Americans and others of goodwill doing their part in God's divine plan. Part of the reason that the Cold War was winnable for Reagan was that the genus of totalitarianism, including its Soviet communist species, was evil. This meant it should not and ultimately could not stand forever. Communism aimed to overturn what God had made, all of creation, including the highest part of his creation, human beings. For Reagan, it mattered that man was made in the image and likeness of God. As a result, human beings were not to be reduced to mere matter, as in Marxism. God was omnipotent, so power could be used for good purposes, although Reagan deeply agreed with Lord Acton that absolute power in the hands of human beings corrupts absolutely. For Reagan, there was goodness propelling the exercise of power in peace through strength because he believed that freedom was morally right and communism was wrong. Those who dismissed SDI as Star Wars did not think Reagan capable of either possessing or expressing a spiritual anthropology. In Reagan presidency scholarship, a strain runs of discovering the anti-nuclear Reagan rather than seeing that Reagan never liked war or nuclear destruction. He was a committed Cold Warrior so that there would be no hot World War III or nuclear destruction. He held these points of principle simultaneously. Yet critics regarded Reagan as a warmonger. And I have been struck here at the library this week at how dominant this criticism of Reagan was at the time. It's all over the place in the files. And sometimes these are the same commentators who see a Reagan I and a Reagan II, rather than analyzing Reagan as a whole person who, as president, prudently applied the same fundamental principles in the sets of circumstances he faced, and seeing that the subsequent actions of America and other states went into his assessments, and that he was capable of looking at short, middle, and long ranges. He was able to keep his end in mind. So the big question then, what was that end? In The Peacemaker, Will Imboden analyzes Reagan's pursuit of and success in bringing the Soviet Union to a negotiated surrender. He responds to and builds on Melvin Leffler's question about whether Reagan aimed to win or to end the Cold War, although the two historians reach different answers. Imboden points out that Reagan was influenced by FDR's insistence on unconditional surrender in World War II, but knew that a similar demand against the USSR would have been delusional and foolhardy in the case of the Cold War. Instead, Reagan combined pressure with diplomacy, working against the Soviet system while working with Soviet leaders in seeking to bring the Kremlin to a negotiated surrender. This is very helpful in examining Reagan's peace through strength strategy. By looking at what made Reagan Reagan, by following him on his intellectual, political, practical, experiential road to the White House, it seems that Reagan always thought the Cold War could be won. He committed to and brought this perspective with him to the White House. What did we win, they lose mean? It meant the false and negative about the USSR, ideology, illegitimate regime, rotting and corrupt state, and the true and positive about America and the West, as well as about those brave dissenting individuals and growing movements and communities wanting and struggling to be free behind and from the Iron Curtain, bringing all he had seen, learned, read, and written, and said since the 1940s about totalitarianism and communism into the 1980s, Reagan identified the current factors undermining the USSR and helped to create the conditions for the Soviets' ideological surrender. And this is the context in which to place surrender, negotiated and strategic, by the USSR. Reagan wanted to free those held captive by ideological despotism. For Reagan, if the truth prevailed, then the legs could be kicked out from under the lies of the totalitarian ideology. As president, Reagan called for and pursued the ideological surrender by the Soviet Union in his grand strategy of peace through strength. The Evil Empire and SDI speeches constitute a culmination of decades of thinking in which Reagan aimed to change the terms of debate and break the status quo. He believed that a victory at the level of ideology would morally disarm the enemy. Political rhetoric, economic recovery and prosperity, armed diplomacy, allied relationships, and well-conceived, consistent pressure on the communist totalitarian core were all essential tools to that strategic end. And in the midst of securing ideological victory toward the end of his presidency, Reagan extended magnanimity in victory. Thank you.
In talking about the arc of Reagan's Soviet rhetoric and policies, I'm boiling down a much larger project. I've written about all Reagan's major Soviet speeches. I also wrote a book about Reagan's great speech at Westminster. I've written with my friend, former student and colleague, John Jones, in much of that work. Students sometimes say to me, Soviet policy, that seems so dated. With Putin's invasion of Ukraine and Chinese efforts to express power in East Asia, it doesn't seem very dated to me. There are three theories that are presented about the influence of Reagan in his Cold War policies and rhetoric. there is a triumphalist theory that simply says Reagan won the Cold War and forced the Soviet Union to collapse. Commentator Charles Krauthammer praised Reagan's policies because it involved real armies supported by the United States, made them, the Soviets, spend blood and pressure in defense of these outposts, and it led to a radical reconsideration in Moscow about the cost of empire. I think this interpretation is quite simplistic because it minimizes or ignores Reagan's consistent advocacy for arms control and Reagan's commitment to nuclear abolition. And you also have to understand that Reagan, of course, forced the Soviets to do nothing. The Soviets made decisions to do nothing, in part based on policies that Reagan implemented that imposed costs on them. A second view, which has been labeled the Reagan reversal view, very distinguished scholar Beth Fisher has developed this view. And she argues, for example, that the Reagan administration pursued a hardline policy only during its first 3 years in office. By January of 1984, Reagan was ardently pursuing rapprochement with Moscow. She's a very sophisticated analysis of the January 16th, 1984, the great speech. There's a third view that I have developed in these essays, and I'm hoping to develop in a book, that I sometimes have called Reagan's rhetorical theory of the Cold War. And that view is not so much a refutation of the Reagan reversal as a reinterpretation of some of the data, arguing that Reagan relied consistently on 4 primary strategies, that these strategies evolved in part in response to the rhetorical situation he faced. For example, the Evil Empire speech in part was aimed at undercutting the nuclear freeze by cementing support from evangelicals, and that it played a crucial tactical role, and that these strategies also evolved creating new conditions, and that allowed for the change in tone that is so evident in the January 16th, 1984 speech. And I point to, just as a starting point, that Reagan continued on occasion very tough talk with the Soviets. It's well known, for example, that he used humor in ways that infuriated Gorbachev. And of course, the Brandenburg Gate speech, in a way, is the most dramatic moment when Reagan challenges the Soviets, saying that they could prove that glasnost and perestroika was real by opening this gate and tearing down this wall. And by the way, defense spending did not begin to decrease in 1984. It peaked in 1987. So I'm going to argue that there are 4 dimensions in what was fundamentally a rhetorical theory. Now, why do I say it's fundamentally rhetorical? Obviously, Reagan used major speeches, and we know from any number of sources that Reagan believed he could win the argument not only with the West, but that he could actually convince the Soviet leaders of the superiority of democratic ideals. He was an idealist. John Lewis Gaddis has written about that Reagan sought to break the stalemate of the Cold War with the potency of ideas. But there's another way that the strategy was fundamentally rhetorical, and that is that all the steps that the Reagan administration took were designed to send a message. In that way, I argue that the arms buildup was not preparation for war, but was preparation for peace. That Reagan did the buildup to create the preconditions to have a strong negotiating hand, and as soon as he thought he had that hand, he immediately took steps that led to the successful negotiations. And that also explains something that's been alluded to, Reagan's famous statement that the only appropriate strategy in the Cold War is that we win and they lose, because that strategy, that goal was based in ideas. One more thing about that, Reagan, more than any other major political figure of the time, understood the weakness of the Soviet Union. Yes, there were experts who recognized the weakness of the Soviet economy, but Reagan saw that before anyone else, and he was often ridiculed for those views by policy commentators of the time. So what are the four components in this grand strategy of the Cold War that I see reflected across the arc of Reagan's rhetoric throughout his presidency? The first one was to, in Reagan's view, speak the truth about the Soviet Union. And we know that Reagan made any number of harsh comments, and as I demonstrate later in the paper, these harsh comments on occasion continued after 1984, and even the great January 16th speech included harsh criticism. I wish I had time to make the argument in detail, but the Ivan and Anya and Jim and Sally passage, one of the most eloquent in all of Reagan, contained an implicit message that Jim and Sally could travel where they want, and Ivan and Anya could not. So this strategy, Jack Matlock referred to it as telling the truth about the Soviet Union. Reagan himself said, when I came into office, I believed there had been some mistakes in our policies. I wanted to do some things differently, like speaking the truth about them for a change. Peter Robinson, the great speechwriter, argued that Reagan's insistence on telling the truth produced a trumpet-like quality to his speeches. And I think that's especially evident in the great, great Soviet speeches. And one goal of this was to get the Soviets' attention. We know that he was successful in doing that. After the Westminster speech, Izvestia labeled Reagan the new Messiah. Richard Pipes said the London speech infuriated the Russians more than anything else Reagan had said. Pipes added that Reagan's response to him when he told that was, "So we touched a nerve." Reagan wanted to touch a nerve to get their attention. He combined that with an arms buildup that, as I have argued previously, was not designed to prepare for war, but was designed to create a strong negotiating position so that he could get real arms reduction. His objection to the previous arms control agreements had been that they had been limitation and not arms reduction. Reagan said in his autobiography, "I wanted to go to the negotiating table and end the madness of the mad policy, but to do that I knew America first had to upgrade its military capabilities so that we would be able to negotiate with the Soviets from a position of strength, not weakness." Third, Reagan supported arms control and ultimately the elimination of nuclear weapons. And he said this many, many times in public. But we did, I remember at the time, not believing that he meant it, thinking it was entirely tactical. But we now know it was not tactical. It was a very firm belief. Even in the Evil Empire speech, Reagan said, "This doesn't mean we should isolate ourselves and refuse to seek an understanding with them. I intend to do everything I can to persuade them of our peaceful intent, to remind that it was the West that refused to use its nuclear monopoly in the 40s and 50s, something he said many times, and then he referenced his proposal for a 50% cut in strategic ballistic missile weapons." Even in the Evil Empire speech, always labeled the most incendiary of Reagan's speeches, although possibly the first press conference might be in that category as well, that Reagan made clear a commitment to arms control. Now, the linchpin of this approach, this grand strategy, was Reagan's defense of democratic ideals. I suggest to you that since the Four Freedoms speech, that the speech at Westminster is the most important speech by a president talking about what Western values, what Western liberalism means. There are wonderful passages in the speech where he makes clear that commitment to democratic values. He echoed Churchill when he said, "From Stettin on the Baltic to Varna on the Black Sea, the regimes planted by totalitarianism have had more than 30 years to establish their legitimacy, but none, not one regime has," and I love this line, "regimes planted by bayonet do not take root." George W. Bush should have read that line before we decided to invade Iraq. I especially like a passage that Reagan wrote himself when he pitched the battle for democracy and freedom in the history of the West, beginning with the Exodus from Egypt. And then in a long rhetorical question, and it's a long quotation, but I'm going to read it to you because it is eloquent on the power of the democratic idea. And Reagan wrote this himself. Who would voluntarily choose not to have the right to vote, decide to purchase government propaganda handouts instead of independent newspapers, prefer government to work or control unions, opt for land to be owned by the state instead of those who till it, want government repression of religious liberty, a single political party instead of free choice, a rigid cultural orthodoxy instead of democratic tolerance and diversity? And again, the truth in those words has been demonstrated. Often regimes have stifled dissent, but it remains that there is a desire. Ideas were utterly central to Reagan's policy. Now, there's evolution over time. In the beginning of his first term, Reagan focused on getting the attention of the Soviets via the tough talk and the arms buildup, while also calling for eventual arms reduction and defending democratic values. After he succeeded in getting the arms buildup in process, there is a shift to greater focus on calls for arms control. It's a shift, what I see as a shift in emphasis. And that's when he proposes the INF and the START talks. And many at the beginning of INF perceived it as an unfair proposal, but it became the basis for the actual treaty that was finally negotiated. I argue that the principle that holds together this strategy is the defense of democratic ideals. Reagan really believed that he could win the argument and create a situation in which it was in the interests of the Soviets to change their policy. He was an idealist and an old romantic classical liberal. The consistency and evolution present in Reagan's Cold War strategy and his rhetoric, I think, reinforce the judgment of Gaddis that Reagan was as skillful a politician as the nation has seen for many years and one of its sharpest strategists ever. I think perhaps it also suggests that American presidents should negotiate against the studio chiefs first. And if they did that, they would learn a great deal. Now, I want to make the argument here that what I've called an evolution in his strategy is reflected across the arc of his rhetoric. Now, I do not have time to develop this now. In the paper, which is really a very rough draft of about the first third of a book, I look at the question of whether Reagan consistently made statements for arms control and statements affirming a desire for peace between 1981 and 1983. And he did. And then I consider whether Reagan continued to critique the Soviet Union and make other statements that were harsh in nature and defend an arms buildup after 1984. And I don't have time to go through that today, but I see that across all the arc of all his major Soviet speeches. What this suggests, I think, is that having a coherent policy based in ideas should be at the core of responding to threats to world peace from totalitarian governments. It seems to me that it has great relevance for how the United States and the West deal not only with Putin and Russia, but also in the future potentially with China. And so I see the evolution of Reagan's Soviet rhetoric as demonstrating one final thing. And you see this in the handwriting files and the speechwriting files, that Reagan was the primary author of this strategy, often overruling the pragmatists in his administration, but also overruling Tony Dolan and the others who were, let us say, less pragmatic. That Reagan was the author of this. In the Westminster speech, and this is only one anecdote, but Reagan either edited or wrote about 60% of the final speech. You cannot spend more than 5 minutes with speeches that Reagan edited. I remember clearly when I first discovered this, the realization that, damn it, Reagan was really smart, because that skill in editing reveals a very sophisticated mind. Thank you very much. Well, we mostly kept to our time limits. And so we have time for some discussion. Questions, comments? Go ahead.
Hi there, Roger Zachan, the Reagan Institute. So great to have all of you here. I am curious, particularly for the last two presentations, what you see Reagan doing prior to his election, as it relates to peace and strength, about his commitment to arms control reduction, the point in the last presentation, that really advanced your theory. Seems there's a lot out there on the record in terms of Reagan working, particularly at the 1976 election and 1981, that might advance your work in Thank you.
Sure, I'll start. You can tell from my presentation that I went earlier and earlier. When I submitted my topic, I was going to be focusing on the two speeches, but then I just kept going backwards. So for me, when I said going back to the 1940s, I mean going back to the 1940s, but the period you're talking about lines up a lot in terms of content and rhetoric with the radio addresses. And we know that Reagan wrote all of those. And so again, looking at his handwriting, like Robin was talking about, is both illuminating and fun. And so you just see over and over and over all these different themes are there that he's going to develop in terms of strategy and policy in the administration. And there are so many examples, but it's in every area too. It's in the military part, it's in the arms reductions argument, it's in his dislike of and hatred of war. The real meaning of peace. He has multiple addresses on the real meaning of peace. He does 2 addresses on the declassification of NSC 68, the classic Truman administration statement, and human rights throughout. You get a lot on that too. So all the different pieces of Reagan are there, and it's as if he's been thinking it through, writing about it, speaking about it, and then he's just ready to go do it. And I'm struck by, I forget where Nancy Reagan writes it, it might be in her own book. She says that her husband was always a writer, and people didn't notice that. And I think getting to spend time in the archives shows that, because you're seeing, I went through the handwriting too, even though we've seen both, the Anderson's books and the Brinkley edition of the diaries and stuff, but it still makes a difference when you can immerse yourself in his handwriting, because that's his brain, as Robin was saying.
And let me add that I've done an analysis of the campaign speeches in 1980 that I think are consistent with the argument I've made. Some of his speechwriters cite the famous debate with Robert Kennedy in the 60s, and the speechwriters say that consistently that the first place they always started was mining Reagan's previous speeches, right, because they agreed that there was consensus that Reagan was his own best speechwriter. So I see continuity. Now, as Reagan assumed office, this happened both when he became governor of California and became president, and he said things with more nuance than he did as a private citizen. And to some extent, that change happened when he was running for president.
If I could add just very quickly on that, Tony Dolan even says in various places, interviews and elsewhere, that when people asked him, how did you write so well for Reagan? He said, it's because I went and read Reagan.
If you should look at the Westminster Address and look at that Dolan draft. and then look at what Reagan does to it. And there are places where Reagan will mark out 4 paragraphs. It'd be big, he'll have a partial sentence, and he'll link it to another sentence 8 or 9 paragraphs later, and doggone if it doesn't read better. And he's cut out things that would have unnecessarily offended people for no reason. And then you look at the things he wrote, like some of the passages I just mentioned, it's just magic. Henry.
I agree with so much what you said. I need to focus on one point where you haven't persuaded me.
And I thought I was following your argument in your book, Henry, about Reagan.
I'm going to give you another chance.
Okay.
You say that he was committed. I love the discussion about leverage,
Right.
building up his capability in order to have leverage in the negotiation. But I guess I'm quarreling a little bit with the objective. His objective, you say, was arms control and abolition.
Right.
But it overlooks the fact that he was always still concerned with deterrence. He was still realistic enough to understand that even if you got rid of weapons and maybe even nuclear weapons, you still were going to face a world in which countries might be able to get those weapons, and you have to respond. What would you use to deter? And into that picture then comes this whole SDI concept that he had in his head. But aren't you, in other words, it seems to me, kind of saying that he was an abolitionist who thought if you got rid of the weapons, you'd get rid of war. I don't think Reagan believed that.
I'm not saying that. Reagan definitely saw, deterrence as a rhetorical purpose. You build up so you don't have to fight. I see that as well. Yeah, we think how many nuclear weapons between the U.S. and the Soviet Union existed before the START Treaty, and how incredibly dangerous it is becoming again as the Chinese are dramatically increasing the number of their nuclear weapons with who knows what kind of command and control and decision-making processes. I think Reagan recognizes those risks and consistently used an arms buildup. Yes, he's for arms control, but to maintaining deterrence. And you've written eloquently about how Reagan thought that you could have conventional forces that have adequate deterrence once you got to an SDI regime. And of course, Reagan, against the advice of virtually everyone, wanted to share the SDI technology, even internationalize the SDI technology, which I think demonstrates what an idealist he was. He's an old romantic liberal, a classical liberal.
So, I really enjoyed the panel. Thank you all for your presentations. And so, for a panel on reassessing Reagan's rhetorical legacy, it totally makes sense that you all focused on Reagan's rhetoric. But to what extent in your work do you grapple with the actual effects of the implementation of Reagan-era policies, and to what extent does the development and implementation of policies reflect the ideals that Reagan touted? And then that's just an open question for anybody who wants to tackle that. And then I did have a more specific question for Randall, because of course the Iranian Communist Party supported Khomeini in the revolution. And so have you found any evidence that intel analysts or Reagan were aware of that connection? And if they were aware of that, why do you think Reagan didn't make more of a big deal about connecting the threats posed by the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I can take that on. So, analysts had known connections between radical Islamist groups, which they grouped Khomeini under, with the Iranian Communist Party. You're talking about the Tudeh Party, for a very, very long time. So that goes back all the way. I mean, I've written about the Eisenhower administration, and that was one of the rationales that they continued to do. And so, intelligence community, I have not come across a specific document that would articulate that threat assessment, but that has been something that I would assume would be found within those types of assessments. Within the larger frame of Iran and the Soviet Union's relationship, Reagan tended not to talk about any type of Middle East politics because his main commitment was to Israel and to Jewish people. And so, insofar as he brought up the 1980 campaign, he wasn't trying to talk about Iran as the Soviets' partner. But what he did say over and over and over again, and what you do find in all sorts of campaign documents, is this illusion that the Soviets are behind everything in the Middle East. They're behind terrorism, They're behind hostage taking, they're behind the PLO, they're behind Lebanon, they're behind everything. And so I think if you're reading between the lines, you can see a type of wary assessment of Iran as a potential partner of the Soviet Union without wanting to declare that outright. In terms of policy, what I would say is the main effect of the tilt of Reagan's demonization of Iran and seeing Iran as an enemy, I would say, resulted in the tilt towards Iraq. So obviously the United States starts sharing geospatial intelligence in 1984, is progressively more involved in helping the Iraqi side, and then by the time Bush comes into office, has established a very close relationship with the Hussein regime there. So I think that there's a sense in which Reagan's rhetoric gives cover to these types of transformations, even though from what I have been able to tell, he wasn't minutely involved in a lot of the policy formulation specifically for the Iran-Iraq War or Persian Gulf specifically.
Allison, do you want to add anything on the relationship of rhetoric and policy?
That's a great question. And thinking about what is the relationship between, I think you said rhetoric and effects, right? Of describing or seeing a particular narrative of the world, and then what does that do on a practical level, right? And so I would say very much agree with what you're saying in this specific case, right, of kind of providing cover. But I also think, too, that, you know, for individual citizens, not everyone was concerned with the minute details of particular, you know, SDI or Star Wars or particular regions of the world, right? And so I think if we think about Reagan's rhetorical legacy more broadly, one of the things that he did do and accomplish is develop a vision for the nation that individuals could see themselves as a part of, right? And the example I always use with students in class is I show them the 1984 convention film, right? And that starts out with individuals being interviewed and saying, you know, I see myself in this particular vision that he has described. And to be clear, you know, it's a vision that some Americans cannot see themselves in, right? But I think that vision and that narrative encapsulates these policy proposals. So even if you have a public that maybe doesn't care about SDI on a technical level, they do, you know, see themselves as a part of this anti-communist narrative, such as, you know, Elizabeth was talking about. And so I think that's where that nexus of rhetoric and effect, or rhetoric and policy, comes in, right? Is that rhetoric can be both a producer of history, and it also provides individuals a narrative that they can see themselves a part of the policy, even if they don't care about the minute details.
Let me add one other thing, that in a way, rhetoric can become the ideology. I'm thinking of the most famous line in the first inaugural address: in this present crisis, government is not the solution, government is the problem. But that became just orthodox conservative policy. In an essay on the first inaugural, I've written about how major figures in conservatism referred to that as doctrine. And by the way, the introductory phrase, in this present crisis, was largely lost in that, and it became simply an anti-government philosophy. Think of how different that is from the environmentalism of Richard Nixon, for example, or even the Montreal Accords that were created, that were negotiated during the Reagan administration, that dealt with the ozone crisis. There was a pragmatic conservatism that those words helped transform into simply an anti-government conservatism.
Hi, Richard Marsh from NORAD. If I can take it back to SDI, a question for anybody that wants to answer: how much did Reagan truly believe in the technology, the ideas behind SDI, and how much was it just a matter of rhetoric, or getting this bargaining position, and establishing a position of strength in the negotiation? Is there a way to know that? Does anyone have an answer?
Well, again, from the 1970s, he at NORAD.
Yeah,
He
I'm
was
kind of interested in that.
Yeah, so when he realized this was a thing, he became very interested in it and what was feasible technologically. So, I mean, the evidence, you know, what you see, including the insert he puts in his handwriting, again, that he wrote for the SDI speech, shows that he thinks this can be, even though it's a dream that he's talking about. He's saying it's attainable, and he believes in America and Americans' abilities to create, to develop. So all of that, I think, meant for him it was a real thing, and it's part of the reason he never wanted to negotiate it away, right? He thought it was a real thing that could be used to bring about real peace.
If he had thought of it as just a strategy, he would have given it away at Reykjavik, because he was very, very close to, even bigger arms reduction agreement. My reading is Reagan was really very good on larger ideological questions, but minute technical questions, I think you're exactly right. He had faith in the scientists, and he didn't need a lot of other details. Go ahead.
Rhetoric, there's always it seems implicitly for many of you who do you
Well, for my project, what I presented today is part of a larger project that analyzes the core images and metaphors that Reagan used to describe his Middle East foreign policy. So for Iran specifically, I think that the metaphor that he used of strategic synthesis paints this picture, right, of this one big battle, and everyone's on one side or the other side, and those logics start to kick in. And so part of that audience question has to do with how does that core image get picked up by press outlets or by other politicians or by the political opposition, as well as Reagan and his team themselves. So there's a question of not just audience, but who is the audience, how are they receiving it, how are they recirculating the ideas, even if they disagree with them. So in my project, that's what I'm tracking, is how do these core images get reproduced across multiple contexts. In terms of audience, though, I mean, there's obviously dozens of figures that you could name, but clearly for my case study, the primary audience would be the American people as well as the international scene, because Reagan is sending messages to Iran what he would consider a red line. He is also sending messages to American allies, reassuring them that we will protect them. There's also this larger question looming in the background of what is the relationship of this conflict to wider American foreign policy.
The Soviet rhetoric's aimed at four audiences. An American audience, he needs to maintain support for the arms buildup, and at the end of his presidency, maintain support for the arms control agreements against conservative opposition. At the time, many conservatives were very skeptical, and some of that's tactical, as I said, responding to the nuclear freeze movement. There's a European audience because there's a major anti-nuclear movement, and he's especially concerned with the West Germans because he's got to maintain support, because it's, putting the Pershings into Europe is the linchpin of the strategy of creating the negotiating strength to get rid of the intermediate range nuclear weapons, which are incredibly dangerous. So a NATO audience, he's obviously speaking to the Soviets. He's saying things that were true, but that presidents never said, because he wants to get their attention. But he's also speaking to the people of Warsaw Pact. And we know from their reaction, which was about half a second after the end of the Soviet Union to ask to join NATO, how effective that message was in combination with their own experience. So I think those are the four crucial audiences. There's a statement about Reagan that he didn't need a pollster because he had an intuitive understanding of the American people. I think he had a very sophisticated understanding of audience and multiple audiences.
I completely agree that he always had multiple audiences in mind. And just one example, echoing what Robin was talking about, for the Evil Empire speech, there's this story about how behind the Iron Curtain in prison, Nathan Sharansky found out about it because the guards let them read Pravda. So he finds out about it by reading Soviet sources, and then he taps out from isolation on the prison walls in the way that they did. Oh my gosh, the President of the United States called it an evil empire, keep fighting. And so we know, this is just one story, but we know many where it mattered, and it helped to create really these conditions, like I said, where people were fighting from within, behind the Iron Curtain, as well as the kind of pressure that the United States was leading the West to do from outside. So I think it's really, really important to keep the multiple audiences in mind, and Reagan did.
I would just add very briefly, several people have noted the importance of looking at the archives. And I think, there are always multiple audiences at play, but also looking at particular moments and speeches, very particular audiences, and the desire to reach specific ones. And I'll just say that the third example that I mentioned, Reagan's speech at Pointe du Hoc, one of the best descriptions of that speech in the process of writing that speech is in Peggy Noonan's What I Saw at the Revolution. And she talks about how she wanted the American public watching at home, because that speech was timed precisely to coincide with the 8 a.m. morning news cycle on the East Coast, which is why, and they went through a lot of discussions with French officials fighting over that time, and the White House was adamant that it had to be at like 2:12 p.m., right, because it's going to be at 8:12 a.m. But Noonan has this incredible passage where she says, my goal was to write so that the president would describe what these U.S. Army Rangers did so that the teenagers who were eating their Rice Krispies would pause and stop and say, that really happened. Because at this moment in U.S. foreign policy, right, is post-Vietnam and thinking about how do we see our vision in the world in this particular moment. And so that was a very specific audience, right, that Noonan was trying to reach. And yet at the same time, it had multiple ripple effects that as it moved out in the campaign film. And it's a passage that is still replayed at various conventions, right? And so I think thinking about those multiple audiences also tells us something of the very specific rhetorical purposes in an individual speech.
We're at the very end, but I want to say one more thing. Use my role as moderator here. I think Reagan was also, in a way, speaking from the past to future Americans. And I want to point to two passages, one in the first inaugural and one in the Great Westminster speech, where he spoke to us about the importance of our democracy. In the first inaugural, he talked about the transition of power as a miracle that almost no other country in the world could claim. I think Reagan, if he were here today, he said we should remember that miracle and protect it. And at the end of the Westminster speech, he spoke of the moment when at the very end of the Second World War, when Churchill lost an election, and he praised him for recognizing the importance of democratic norms and leaving power, and noting that he came back again later on. It seems to me the greatest importance of Reagan ultimately is in his rhetoric is for that defense of democratic values as central to the American story, and his belief that ideas could move mountains, and they did in the Cold War, and perhaps they can again. So thank you very much.